Hello guys, I'm glad you are here tonight, ready to close your eyes and sink into a long, quiet journey through the sands of time. Before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? It always fascinates me to imagine how this story is reaching different corners of the world. Someone perhaps in America listening late at night, someone in Europe drifting off after a long day, maybe someone in Asia just waking up with the sun. So tell me, even if only silently to yourself, where are you and what hour is written on your clock? Now, let us drift back thousands of years to a land of golden deserts, of eternal rivers, of massive stone monuments that rise against the endless sky. Egypt, the kingdom of the pharaohs, a land that has always captured the imagination of mankind. When you think of ancient Egypt, you may picture glittering palaces, treasures of gold, mysterious tombs, and gods with the heads of falcons, jackals, and cats. You may see the pyramids, great mountains of stone, standing silent under the burning sun. And yet, beneath that glittering surface, hidden under layers of sand and silence, there were people whose names were never written, whose voices were never recorded, but whose lives carried the true weight of Egypt's greatness. They were the slaves. Our story will follow one of them. He is not a king, not a priest, not a general remembered in history books. He is simply a man. For now, let us call him Nakht. His name in the Egyptian tongue means the strong one, though life has forced him to carry more burdens than strength alone could bear. He was born with no promise of freedom, no right to possessions, no certainty of tomorrow. And yet, like all men, he carried dreams, fears, small joys, and the will to survive. Through his eyes, we will step into that ancient world, not as visitors in a museum, but as if we were there, barefoot in the dust, under the same sun, breathing the same dry air. Nakht's first memory is not of laughter or family comfort, but of work. The scorching heat of the sun on his bare back, the taste of sand blown by desert wind, and the sharp crack of the overseer's whip cutting through the air. He was still a boy then, not yet strong enough to carry the stones or swing the heavy tools, but already he knew what it meant to belong to someone else. His world was measured not by his own wishes, but by the commands of men who saw him as a tool, a hand, a back to bend, and nothing more. But Nakht also remembers the Nile. Even in the darkest moments, the Nile was there. He remembered sneaking away for a brief instant, dipping his feet into the cool current, and watching the great river roll by like a ribbon of life through endless desert. For him, it was more than water, it was freedom, if only for a heartbeat. Because the Nile did not belong to Pharaoh, nor to the priests, nor to the overseers. It belonged to the earth itself. And sometimes Nakht imagined that if he could only follow it far enough, maybe it would lead him beyond Egypt, beyond slavery, beyond everything he knew. The boy grew into a man, but the chains of duty never loosened. By the time he could lift the heavy stones, he was already hardened by years of labor. He worked in the fields when the Nile's flood retreated, planting grain in the rich black soil. He hauled baskets of mud to build dikes and irrigation channels. And, at times, he was sent with others to work on temples and monuments that rose higher and higher into the sky. There were days when he looked up at the massive blocks of limestone being dragged across wooden sledges, and he thought to himself, "These stones will outlive me, and yet my name will vanish like dust." But Nakht was not alone. Around him, countless others lived the same life, their stories woven together like threads in a rough linen cloth. Some were captured from foreign lands, Nubians, Libyans, Syrians, brought in after Egypt's armies had swept through their homes. Others were born, like Nakht, into families that had been enslaved for generations. Despite their differences in language and origin, they shared the same exhaustion, the same hunger, the same faint flicker of hope that tomorrow might be kinder than today. At night, when the overseer's eyes were gone and the desert cooled, Nakht sometimes sat with the others near small fires. They whispered stories, half-remembered myths of gods and kings, songs of lands they had never seen but dreamed of. Some spoke of miracles, of gods who showed mercy to the poor. Others spoke of escape, though everyone knew the desert was a prison without walls. And Nakht listened, his heart torn between despair and the tiny, stubborn ember of belief that there had to be more to life than carrying stones until his back broke. And so, as the stars glimmered over the black silhouette of the pyramids, and the Nile whispered in the distance, Nakht closed his eyes and dreamed. Dreamed of freedom. Dreamed of walking barefoot not in chains but in choice. Dreamed of telling his own story one day. That is where our journey begins, under the endless Egyptian sky, beside the Nile, with a man who history has forgotten, but whose life speaks louder than stone. Nakht's childhood was not filled with toys or lessons, but with labor. His earliest memories carried the sound of his mother's voice, soft, low, almost always tired. She was also a slave, and her arms were as worn as the linen cloth that wrapped her body. She worked in the fields near the Nile, and Nakht followed her, too small to carry a tool, but large enough to fetch water, gather scraps, or shoo birds away from the crops. He would watch her bend low under the sun, her back glistening with sweat, and even as a boy he understood that survival meant obedience, endurance, and silence. Other children around him were the same. They did not chase one another with laughter in open courtyards, as noble children might have done. Instead, they learned to carry baskets, to grind grain, to patch torn baskets and mend ropes. They practiced the small skills of survival because their lives would be nothing but preparation for harder years to come. Childhood, for Nakht, was not a time of innocence. It was simply the first chapter of servitude. And yet, amid the weight of work, there were fragments of wonder. He remembered how the sky seemed impossibly wide, stretching beyond the desert dunes. He remembered the fragrance of damp earth after the Nile flood, the smell of wet black mud that promised food would grow. He remembered, too, the stories whispered by the elders at night, around small fires, in shadows where overseers rarely bothered to look. The older slaves spoke of gods and creation, of how Ra sailed across the heavens in his golden boat, dragging the sun with him each morning. They spoke of Osiris, who ruled the land of the dead with fairness, and of Anubis, who guided souls into eternity. As a child, Nakht clung to those stories. They gave shape to the world around him. When he saw the blazing sun, he imagined Ra fighting serpents in the sky. When he watched the stars, he believed they were eyes of gods watching silently over men. These myths made him feel less alone, as though even his suffering had been seen and measured by the divine. Perhaps, he thought, the gods noticed even those like him, those whose names would never be carved into stone. But childhood also brought fear. There was the constant threat of the overseer's whip, always ready to strike when hands moved too slowly or backs straightened for too long. The sting of leather across skin was not just pain. It was humiliation, a reminder that his body did not belong to him. Nakht learned quickly to bow his head, to hide his anger, to swallow his words. He learned that tears were dangerous because they showed weakness, and weakness was never forgiven. Some nights, when his mother held him close, he whispered a question. "Why are we slaves? Why are we not free? She would sigh, her breath heavy, and stroke his hair with fingers cracked from labor. Because this is the way of the world, my son. Some are born to command and others are born to serve. But the gods see us. They will remember what men forget. And though Nakht wanted to believe her, deep in his heart he wondered if the gods truly heard the cries of the weak. His father he barely remembered, a broad-shouldered man with calloused hands. He was sent away to work in the quarries when Nakht was still small. Sometimes rumors reached them, of men crushed under falling stone, of accidents where the earth swallowed whole crews alive. Nakht never saw his father again. His mother never spoke of it directly, but Nakht noticed the way her eyes sometimes lingered on the horizon at dusk, as if she still waited for a shadow that never returned. As Nakht grew, he began to take on heavier tasks. He carried jars of water for older workers. He dragged bundles of reeds for weaving. He learned how to balance baskets on his shoulders, the weight cutting into his collarbone. At first, every step felt impossible, but the human body is stubborn in its endurance. Soon, he grew stronger, his muscles hardening, his skin darkened by the relentless sun. But strength did not bring freedom, it only made him more useful. The world around him was rich with contrasts. He saw noblemen pass by in painted boats along the Nile, shaded by canopies, servants fanning them as they drank wine. Their laughter carried across the water, light and careless, while Nakht and others bent low in the fields, their hands sticky with mud. He saw temple priests in spotless white linen, chanting hymns to the gods while incense curled in the air. The slaves, meanwhile, whispered their prayers under their breath, hoping the same gods listened to voices without offerings. Sometimes, as he looked at the world of the free, Nakht wondered if life had been decided before birth, as though men were born carrying invisible marks, one destined for gold, the other for chains. And if that were true, then he asked himself silently, what mark had he been given, and why? Despite these thoughts, there were moments when he felt the simple pulse of life. He remembered chasing fish in the shallow waters, laughing with other boys for a rare instant of play. He remembered the taste of sweet dates, a treat shared when one of the older men managed to hide a handful from the overseer's eye. He remembered the scent of burning resin at festival time, when even the poorest caught a glimpse of music, dance, and color. These moments were fleeting, like sparks in darkness, but they taught him that even in bondage, the heart could find ways to breathe. The years rolled on, as steady as the Nile's current. Childhood slipped quietly into manhood, not with ceremony, but with labor. Nakht's hands grew hard, his shoulders broad, his back bent with endless loads. By then, he no longer questioned why he was a slave. He only questioned how much longer his body could endure. And yet, he endured. The pyramids grew higher, the temples spread wider, and still Nakht carried, hauled, and toiled. He was one man among thousands, nameless in the records of kings, but alive in the dust, alive in the sweat, alive in the silence between the overseer's shouts. And it was in that silence that Nakht began to notice something stirring inside him. Not rebellion, not yet, but a hunger for meaning. If life was only labor, if death was only darkness, then what purpose had the gods given him? He did not know the answer, but the question, once born, never left him. The day began long before the sun dared to rise above the horizon. Nakht's eyes opened to the cold, damp air of the slave huts, a mixture of dust, mud, and the faint scent of river reeds. There was no alarm clock, no gentle call, only the groans and murmurs of hundreds of men, women and children stirring, preparing themselves for another day of toil. Each sound was a signal. The bending of bodies, the scraping of bare feet across hardened mud, the clink of wooden tools being readied. It was a symphony of labor, conducted by the unseen hand of necessity, as unrelenting as the desert sun. By the time Nakht had risen and stretched his aching back, the first overseers were already patrolling the rows of huts, their sandals kicking up clouds of dust. The whip, coiled at their sides, gleamed faintly in the dim light, a constant promise of pain for any delay, any misstep. There was no discussion, no negotiation. Work began the moment the first rays of dawn lit the horizon, or even before, depending on the overseer's mood. And so Nakht followed the others, silently, carrying the weight of expectation even before the weight of the day's labor. On some mornings, he and a group of men were sent to the fields, where the soil was dark and fertile, freshly exposed by the receding Nile flood. Nakht bent over the earth, planting grain in precise rows, his hands blistered, knuckles cracked from the rough mud. He moved in rhythm with the others, a silent understanding passing between them. Too slow, and the overseer's whip would strike. Too fast, and exhaustion might shatter the body before nightfall. The fields stretched endlessly, a mosaic of green and brown under the rising sun, and Nakht could see the shimmering river in the distance, a cruel reminder of life flowing freely beyond the chains of labor. Other days demanded different forms of endurance. Sometimes he was called to the quarries, to work with limestone or granite, each block heavier than a man could lift alone. Nakht learned to read the stone, to understand its weight, to time each heave with his companions. Wooden sledges groaned under the load, sand gave way underfoot, and the sun reflected mercilessly off the pale rock. Sweat ran down his neck, stung his eyes, soaked his linen, but the work never paused. Overseers shouted orders, and the slightest hesitation brought the sharp crack of leather against flesh. Yet, even under these harsh conditions, Nakht felt a certain grim satisfaction in his strength, in the sheer stubbornness of surviving day after day. Sometimes the work led them to temples, where stones were carefully shaped for altars, walls, and statues. Here, precision mattered as much as strength. Nakht had to smooth surfaces, measure angles, and polish rough edges, often on his knees, his back bent in ways that would leave scars for life. And yet, even in these sacred spaces, the grandeur was a constant torment. He saw priests moving in flowing robes, their fingers tracing hieroglyphs with reverence, while he labored in the dust, invisible, necessary, and forgotten. The contrast was brutal, a reminder that skill and devotion meant little when one's birth had assigned a life of service. Midday offered no relief. The sun reached its zenith, burning the sand beneath Nakht's feet, heating the air into a shimmering haze. Water was scarce, only what was rationed, carried in jars that themselves demanded effort to lift. Hunger gnawed at him, but there was no pause for meals. Occasionally, bread, coarse, dry, barely enough, was handed out, sometimes accompanied by a sip of weak beer, a temporary comfort, more for sustenance than pleasure. Nakht learned to eat quickly, to swallow without thought, to save every calorie for the hours still to come. Despite the relentless schedule, Nakht noticed the small rhythms that shaped life among the slaves. A nod to a companion, a whispered joke while stacking stones, the shared glance at a bird daring to land near the worksite. These fleeting moments of humanity were precious. Even the overseers had patterns. Some were crueler than others, but they too moved predictably, their rage cycling with the day, their attention divided between punishment and the practical need to get the work done. Nakht studied them as one studies a storm. Know its pattern, and perhaps it will not strike too fiercely. Evenings were a different kind of challenge. By the time the sun sank low, the body screamed for rest, yet the work often extended into twilight. Fields still needed tending, stones needed stacking, walls needed finishing. Nakht's back was stiff, his hands raw, his feet blistered, yet he pressed on. Sometimes, as he carried yet another stone or pulled another sledge, he imagined what it would be like to walk unburdened, to feel the cool river on his skin without the overseer's gaze. But such thoughts were dangerous as neglecting the work itself. And yet, work was not merely suffering. Taught Nakht endurance, patience, observation. He learned to notice the subtle signs in the Nile's floodplain that predicted the fertility of soil, to feel the weight and balance of a stone that seemed too large to move, to understand the whispered languages of his companions without speaking. Labor became both prison and school, each task a lesson in survival, each day a measure of his own resilience. When the last rays of sun faded and the overseer's voices grew distant, Nakht returned to the huts, limbs aching, skin blistered, muscles trembling. The air was cooler, scented with mud, reed, and the faint fragrance of cooking fires. He collapsed onto the hard floor, listening to the chorus of groans, whispers, and soft sobs around him. Even in exhaustion, he noticed the tiny sparks of life. A shared story, a laugh at a minor misstep, a hand held to comfort. These were small defiance, small reminders that despite chains, the human spirit persisted. The rhythm of Nakht's life became almost predictable. Rise, labor, endure, return, rest, repeat. But no day was truly the same. The Nile flooded differently each year. Overseers changed, new tasks emerged, and rumors drifted on the wind. Sometimes he heard whispers of distant lands, of Pharaoh's campaigns, of riches carried down the river, of curses buried in tombs that might touch even those who labored in the shadows. Each fragment of story, each sensation, each exertion built the map of Nakht's existence, a map he would carry in memory long after his body became dust. And so, day after day, Nakht moved through the world, unseen yet essential, his life a thread in the vast tapestry of Egypt. Strength was required, endurance was demanded, hope was fleeting. Yet his mind and heart remained his own, even if the sun and the overseer sought to claim them. In every blistered hand, in every aching back, there was a story, and Nakht's story had only begun. Even after the long, punishing hours of labor, Nakht's struggles did not end. Returning to the huts did not mean relief, only a different kind of endurance. The living quarters were cramped, dark, and simple beyond imagination. Built from mud bricks or reeds, the walls were thin, allowing the desert wind to slip in, carrying dust, sand, and the occasional chill at night. The floors were hard, bare, and uneven, littered with the detritus of 1,000 exhausted bodies. There were no mattresses, no soft blankets, only layers of woven reeds or rough cloth, which offered little more than a barrier between the body and the cold, coarse ground. Sleep was a temporary escape, a fleeting relief from a day that demanded everything. Food was meager and monotonous. Bread, made from coarse emmer wheat, formed the staple of every meal. It was dense and dry, barely enough to sustain the body, yet the slaves learned to savor even its rough texture. Sometimes a few scraps of onion or garlic were added, occasionally lentils or beans if the Nile had been generous. Water was rationed carefully, carried from the river in jars, and beer, weak and thin, was a luxury that might accompany the bread. These small comforts, though minimal, were treasured. Nakht remembered nights when the ration was particularly thin, when hunger gnawed relentlessly at his belly, and yet he shared his meager portion with a younger boy, understanding that survival was as much about unity as it was about sustenance. Illness and injury were constant threats. In the huts, disease moved quietly, spreading from one person to another with terrifying speed. Coughs, fevers, and rashes were common, and often deadly. Nakht saw companions fall ill, their bodies weakening day by day, sometimes never to rise again. Remedies were rudimentary: herbs, crushed roots, poultices, and prayers. The knowledge of medicine was limited, yet the older slaves shared what little they knew, whispering instructions for poultices or protective charms from the gods. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, Nakht would kneel quietly and pray that the gods would watch over the sick, though he never knew if they did. Hygiene was a constant struggle. Bathing was rare, reserved for when the Nile permitted, or when an overseer allowed a brief respite. Clothing was simple: a strip of linen wrapped around the waist, sometimes a tunic, often nothing more. The fabric was rough, worn thin by labor and sun, sometimes patched repeatedly with scraps of leftover cloth. The skin of Nakht's back, arms, and legs was perpetually darkened by sun, marred by scratches, scars, and the marks of whips. These were the badges of survival, the silent evidence of endurance. Yet, in these conditions, there were moments of resilience. The huts were places of whispered stories, of quiet laughter, and shared memory. Around small fires, Nakht listened to the tales of older slaves who remembered lands beyond the Nile, who spoke of Pharaoh's extravagance, who recounted ancient myths with voices low and melodic. These stories were more than entertainment. They were a lifeline, a bridge between suffering and the imagination, proof that even in the harshest existence, the mind and spirit could wander free. Nakht also noticed the subtle rituals that kept hope alive. Each evening, before sleep, he would lay out a tiny offering near the hut's entrance. A bit of bread, a small clay figurine, a whispered prayer. Perhaps it was Osiris who watched, or Anubis who guided the departed, or Ra who sailed the sky. Perhaps it was nothing at all. But Nakht clung to these rituals because they were a way to assert some control in a life otherwise dominated by others. Even small gestures mattered. Interactions among slaves were fragile, but vital. Bonds formed quickly in the crucible of shared hardship. A hand to help lift a stone, a whispered warning of an overseer approaching, the sharing of food, the brief moments of amusement at a child's misstep. These interactions were survival in its most human form. Nakht learned to observe, to read faces, to understand moods without words. Trust was scarce, but among those who shared the trials of the day, loyalty and camaraderie blossomed quietly. Life was not merely endured, it was adapted to. Nakht became adept at navigating the constant threats of injury, hunger, and punishment. He memorized the rotation of tasks, learned which overseers were more merciful, understood which paths to the river were safest. The physical world was unforgiving. The sun burned relentlessly, sand scoured the skin, stones cut hands, but the mind could find strategies, small openings, and moments of relief. Survival depended on vigilance, cunning, and endurance. Evenings, when the desert air cooled and the sun sank behind distant dunes, offered fleeting beauty. Nakht would watch the horizon, the colors of twilight reflecting in the water, birds returning to the river, the silhouettes of palm trees swaying gently. In those moments, the harshness of the day seemed suspended, replaced by something quieter, almost peaceful. These glimpses of the natural world reminded him that life existed beyond labor, that beauty could still be found even where suffering was constant. Slaves' lives were marked by routine, yet no day was truly predictable. A sudden command, a shift in overseers, the arrival of foreign workers, a festival, or the unexpected bounty of a fertile field could change the rhythm, sometimes bringing relief, sometimes new trials. Nakht learned to anticipate, to endure, to observe, to imagine beyond the present. The huts, the bread, the heat, and the cold were all part of the pattern, and each night, as exhaustion claimed him, Nakht reflected on what he had learned about survival, resilience, and the quiet assertion of self in a world that demanded submission. By the time sleep finally came, Nakht's body was battered, but his mind was alert. Each mark, each scar, each blister told a story of endurance. Each whispered tale from elders, each song softly sung in the hut, carried a lesson. Though the walls were thin, the air heavy, and the floor hard, Nakht carried something invisible with him. Something no overseer could claim, no law could take away. The awareness of life, the capacity for thought, memory, and imagination. These were his possessions, his freedom, his secret defiance in a world built on chains. Religion was woven into every aspect of Nakht's existence, whether he noticed it consciously or not. From sunrise to sunset, the gods were present in whispers, gestures, and rituals, shaping not only the world around him but also the small flickers of hope that kept him moving through relentless labor. Though he was a slave, powerless in the eyes of men, the gods offered a kind of unseen companionship, a quiet presence that no overseer could suppress. Nakht learned the names of many gods as a boy, and each carried meaning and consequence. Ra, the sun god, sailed his golden boat across the sky, chasing away darkness and serpent alike. Osiris, lord of the afterlife, watched over the dead and judged them fairly. Anubis, with the head of a jackal, guided souls through the shadowed corridors of the beyond. Hathor, the goddess of music, dance, and joy, was said to bless the living with moments of fleeting happiness. Each name was spoken with care, even when uttered softly under the breath, for speaking it with reverence was as much a protection as prayer itself. Daily work was punctuated by small, almost invisible acts of devotion. Nakht would pause briefly as the sun rose, raising a hand to shield his eyes, silently invoking Ra's mercy for endurance under the scorching heat. Before lifting heavy stones, he whispered to Osiris, asking for strength, for steady hands, for a day without injury. Sometimes he touched the ground with his forehead, a humble bow of respect to the gods who ruled the earth beneath his feet. These gestures were not just superstition. They were reassurance, a quiet ritual that reminded him that he was more than muscle and sweat, that the universe held forces beyond the reach of the whip or overseer. The stories of the gods were also a source of guidance and reflection. Elders recounted the myths of creation, of Adam emerging from the primordial waters to form the world, of Nut swallowing the sun each night and birthing it anew. Nakht listened, imagining the vastness of the cosmos, the endless cycles of life and death, and he realized that even the greatest of men, the pharaohs themselves, were subject to forces far greater than their palaces or armies. In these stories, Nakht found perspective. His suffering was immense, yet it was part of a larger rhythm, a pattern that even gods obeyed in their own way. But religion was not only about cosmic order. It was about hope in the immediate, tangible moments of life. When Nakht fell ill or when a companion was struck by a tool, he prayed. When the sun scorched his back or a stone slipped from the sledge, he invoked the gods' protection. And in return, the world sometimes offered small mercies. A cooler breeze along the Nile, a break in the overseer's attention, a stranger's smile. Nakht came to believe that the gods were subtle, working not through miracles but through tiny, almost imperceptible interventions that allowed life to continue, even under chains. During festivals and ceremonial days, religion took on a more visible and celebratory form. Slaves were occasionally allowed to witness temple rituals, where incense smoke twisted upward, priests chanted in solemn harmony, and offerings of grain, beer, and flowers were laid before statues of gods. Nakht observed these ceremonies with awe, not just for their grandeur, but for their reminder of order and rhythm in the world. Even a slave could see the beauty, even if he could not participate fully. And sometimes, the air itself seemed to carry a promise, a sense that life was larger than toil and that the divine could watch over even those deemed invisible by society. Nakht also noticed the power of community prayers. When a companion was sick, the others would gather, forming a small circle, hands joined or resting on one another's shoulders, voices soft but insistent in their pleas to the gods. These gatherings were brief, quiet, and often unnoticed by overseers, yet they carried profound significance. Nakht felt the warmth of human connection in these moments, a shared belief that the divine could listen, that the collective hope of many hearts might reach the heavens. Superstition intertwined with faith, shaping behaviors in ways that were sometimes subtle, sometimes dramatic. Certain days were avoided for heavy work, thought to be cursed by the gods. Certain stones were considered unlucky, and workers would whisper warnings to one another when handling them. Nakht himself had adopted small practices. A touch of clay on his wrist, a knot tied in a cord, a whispered mantra before lifting the heaviest load. Whether these gestures had power or not, they gave him a sense of control in a life otherwise governed by others. Yet faith was not blind. Nakht questioned, doubted, and even resented the gods at times. When a friend was struck down, when hunger gnawed unbearably, when overseers' cruelty seemed endless, he wondered if the gods truly cared. But these doubts did not eliminate his devotion. They complicated it, made it richer. He learned that faith could coexist with suffering, that hope could persist even when answers were absent, and that the human spirit could navigate despair through ritual, story, and belief. Even in solitary moments, Nakht found solace in nature as an expression of the divine. The Nile's slow current, the rise and fall of the desert dunes, the call of birds at dusk, all were reminders that life continued beyond the immediacy of work and pain. He would kneel by the riverbank, letting the water lap at his bare feet, whispering thanks or pleading for mercy. Sometimes he imagined the gods watching, approving, or at least acknowledging his presence. These moments became essential, a quiet rhythm of hope that sustained him through months of relentless labor. Religion also shaped Nakht's dreams. In sleep, he often found himself in imagined temples, walking among towering statues of gods, receiving silent guidance or words of comfort. Sometimes he dreamed of freedom, not as a rebellion against men, but as a journey toward divine understanding, a pilgrimage through landscapes both real and imagined. In these dreams, the limits imposed by slavery dissolved, replaced by vast horizons, flowing rivers, and skies painted with possibilities. Through it all, Nakht came to understand that religion was not merely ritual, it was a lifeline. It gave structure to chaos, hope to despair, and meaning to suffering. It allowed a slave to endure heat, hunger, and cruelty with a sense that his life was part of something larger, that even his smallest prayers were threads in the tapestry of eternity. In a world that had stripped him of choice, religion offered a private sovereignty, an inner space where Nakht could stand as his own master, even if only in thought and spirit. And so, under the Egyptian sky, beside the eternal Nile, Nakht continued his days, guided by labor, sustained by belief, and driven by a hope that life, in its vast and mysterious design, had a purpose yet to be revealed to him. Nakht had always known the stories of Pharaoh, of the great man who ruled with absolute authority, whose word shaped the fate of all Egypt. But knowing of Pharaoh through whispers and distant tales was one thing. Seeing his world was another entirely. It happened one day when Nakht and a group of slaves were sent to work on the outer courtyards of the royal palace, a place usually reserved for the highest priests, soldiers, and officials. Even at a distance, Nakht could feel the weight of hierarchy pressing upon him, a tangible reminder of the vast gulf between his life and the rulers who seemed to touch the very heavens with their power. The palace loomed ahead like a mountain made of stone, its walls towering, flawless, impossibly high. Nakht had seen temples before, had hauled blocks for their construction, had polished limestone for statues, but the palace was on an entirely different scale. The stones were smooth, carved with intricate reliefs depicting Pharaoh's victories, offerings to the gods, and symbols of divine authority. Gold glinted faintly in the sunlight, catching Nakht's eye even from his position in the shadow of labor. He noticed that no detail was overlooked. Hieroglyphs perfectly etched, columns precisely aligned, courtyards immaculately arranged. Every block, every statue, every surface spoke of power, control, and an obsession with perfection. As they approached the worksite, Nakht caught glimpses of the palace inhabitants. Men in flowing white linen, adorned with collars of colored stones, moved with confidence and ease. Priests chanted as they prepared offerings, their voices rising and falling in measured cadences that seemed to harmonize with the rhythm of the Nile itself. Guards patrolled with spears, eyes sharp, expressions unreadable. Even the servants and attendants, though lower in rank, carried themselves differently from slaves. They moved as though the palace itself belonged to them, as though the air smelled sweeter within these walls, the light warmer, and the sun less oppressive. Nakht was ordered to haul large bundles of reeds, used for palace roofing and flooring, across the outer courtyard. The task was physically exhausting, but his attention was drawn constantly to the palace itself. He could see Pharaoh's chambers through open doors, glimpses of painted walls, mosaics, and golden ornaments. Musicians played softly in shaded corridors, their melodies floating faintly across the stone. The contrast struck Nakht with an almost painful clarity. Here was wealth, leisure, and beauty. Beyond these walls, there was labor, dust, hunger, and constant pain. It was a world divided not by geography, but by power and birthright, and Nakht felt both awe and bitterness in equal measure. During brief moments of rest, Nakht observed more closely. Women attended the pharaoh, carrying trays of scented oils, polishing jewelry, or arranging flowers with meticulous care. Children of high rank ran across the courtyards, laughing freely, their bare feet uncalloused, their bodies unmarked by the sun or labor. Even the animals seemed different, dogs pampered, birds in gilded cages, exotic creatures brought from distant lands. Nakht could not help but imagine their freedom, their ease, and how far removed their lives were from the mud, sweat, and blood of those building these very spaces. The overseer barked orders, pulling Nakht back from his contemplation, reminding him that his place was among the laborers, not the elite. Yet, even as he hauled, bent, and struggled under the weight, Nakht's mind could not leave the palace. He wondered about Pharaoh's mind. Did he even notice the faces of the men building his world? Did he understand that countless lives were consumed for his comfort and glory? The thought sparked a flicker of resentment, but also fascination. To be so powerful, to command such obedience and wealth, was unimaginable. And yet, Nakht reminded himself it was also the ultimate reminder of his own insignificance in the grand design of Egyptian society. Despite the apparent cruelty of inequality, Nakht noticed subtler lessons in the palace. Order, precision, and diligence were rewarded, even if the reward was only avoidance of punishment. The palace's smooth, flawless surfaces, the alignment of statues, the synchronized movements of servants, all revealed the value placed on consistency and attention. Nakht began to apply these observations to his own labor. Even small acts of care, smoothing the edges of a basket, stacking stones more carefully, offered a sense of control and accomplishment, even within the boundaries imposed by others. Yet the palace was also a place of tension and danger. Oversight was constant. Any misstep was immediately punished, not just by physical means, but by public humiliation. Nakht saw a man stumble while carrying a heavy bundle. The overseer struck him repeatedly, the man collapsing under the pain, and all around, the other slaves flinched at the sound. It was a vivid reminder that beauty and grandeur were often built upon suffering, that perfection for the elite demanded endurance, and that life in the palace's shadow was measured in obedience. At night, when the day's labor ended and the slaves returned to their huts, Nakht's thoughts lingered on what he had seen. The palace, though dazzling, was also distant and untouchable. It was a world that belonged to others, a realm of gods in human form, while he remained anchored in dust, sweat, and survival. Yet Nakht also carried new understanding. He had glimpsed the mechanics of power, the way order, fear, and skill could shape reality. Even in slavery, knowledge mattered. Observation, patience, and awareness could make life bearable, perhaps even offer small advantages in an otherwise merciless existence. As he lay on the hard floor that night, muscles still aching, skin blistered, Nakht allowed his mind to wander. He imagined walking the corridors freely, touching the smooth walls, hearing music without having to work for it. He imagined speaking to the Pharaoh, though he knew it impossible, and asking questions that no king had ever considered. And then he returned to reality, silent, exhausted, yet alert, understanding that the palace was both inspiration and warning. It reminded him of what existed beyond survival, of what life could be in another form, and of why endurance, cunning, and hope remained essential. Whispers traveled faster than the overseers ever realized. Nakht first heard them one evening, carried on the wind through the tight corridors of the huts, soft voices merging with the crackle of small fires. Stories of distant uprisings, tales of slaves daring to resist their masters, and rumors of hidden treasures left unguarded in remote temples. It was dangerous knowledge, yet irresistible. Curiosity and fear coexisted in every whisper, threading a tension through the air that the overseers could never fully suppress. Some tales spoke of rebels in faraway villages, slaves who had refused to work, who had taken what they needed and vanished into the desert, free from the yoke of kings and nobles. Others told of secret alliances, small groups organizing quietly, planning escape or sabotage, daring to imagine a life outside the relentless rhythm of labor. Nakht listened intently, heart hammering, a mix of awe and caution. It was tempting to hope, yet he had learned caution was survival. Even a whispered word could summon a whip, a public beating, or worse. Nakht began noticing signs that others were listening too. Eyes flicked nervously toward the hut's entrances. Hands rested lightly on hidden tools. Nods exchanged in silence. The air seemed charged, a subtle current of anticipation weaving among the men and women who had endured years of servitude. Rumors, Nakht realized, were more than stories. They were the first threads of collective thought, the sparks of imagination that could ignite action. Even in bondage, the human mind sought freedom, and whispers became proof that not all hearts were entirely broken. Some stories were cautionary, warnings cloaked in legend. They spoke of slaves who had tried to flee, only to be hunted down by guards and returned in chains, their bodies punished as an example to others. Nakht felt the weight of these warnings, a reminder that desire alone could not overcome the rigid structures of society. Yet, within the fear there was fascination. The idea that one could resist, even slightly, even symbolically, stirred something in him. He began watching more closely. Overseers, patrols, the guards along the Nile. Mapping routines in his mind, imagining possibilities, thinking in secret about paths no one else might consider. Among these rumors, one story captivated him more than the others. It spoke of a forgotten chamber beneath a temple, where the priests kept supplies, hidden treasures, and sacred artifacts. The tale was vague, passed in hushed tones, but Nakht could not shake it from his mind. He imagined its walls lined with gold, jars of food, water, and precious objects untouched by overseers or Pharaoh. It was more than wealth, it was possibility. Even if it was only a legend, the chamber represented the idea that the world held secrets, openings in a system that seemed absolute. Nakht's companions discussed these rumors quietly, always in small groups, always wary. They spoke of escape routes, of the desert's hidden paths, of places where water might be found, or where strangers might help. Nakht listened, asked questions carefully, and began to form his own mental maps. He had always relied on physical strength and endurance. Now he realized that knowledge and strategy could be as valuable as muscle. The whispers were dangerous, yet they were education in the art of survival beyond the daily grind. The overseers, of course, were never far. Nakht had learned to watch their moods, to anticipate when anger might flare, when a minor misstep could become a punishment. Even while imagining freedom or secret chambers, he moved with precision, his back straight, his hands steady, his eyes careful not to linger too long on anything that could be construed as insolence. Survival was a delicate balance between curiosity and caution, between hope and pragmatism. Every whispered rumor was a test, a gamble that could cost life or liberty in the smallest way, yet offered a taste of something beyond. One evening, a new rumor reached Nakht's ears. It spoke of a slave who had learned the secrets of the Pharaoh's storage rooms, who had moved unnoticed among the corridors, observing rituals, listening to priests, and discovering small weaknesses in the palace's defenses. Nakht felt a thrill, imagining himself in that place, a shadow among shadows, walking unseen, understanding, learning, perhaps even taking action. The idea was intoxicating yet terrifying. Even if true, the risk was enormous. A single misstep could bring death not only to him but to others. Still, Nakht could not dismiss it. The story gnawed at his mind, becoming a framework for thought. Perhaps survival was not only enduring blows, hauling stones, and bending to the sun, but also learning, watching, and understanding the structures that bound him. Perhaps, in observing, in remembering patterns, and in quietly imagining alternatives, he could carve small spaces of control in a world that sought to deny him any. The whispers, the rumors, the fragments of rebellion, they were more than stories. They were hope, fragile and dangerous, yet undeniable. They reminded Nakht that the human spirit could never be entirely subdued, that even in chains, men and women sought agency, knowledge, and the possibility of action. He began to pay closer attention to the world beyond the fields and huts, the patrols, the guards, the riverbanks, the temples, and to imagine how small choices could alter outcomes. In the quiet of night, as other slaves slept, Nakht would replay these whispers in his mind, turning each story over like a stone, imagining possibilities, strategies, and consequences. The weight of labor and exhaustion remained, but a spark had been ignited, a sense that he was part of something larger, even if invisible, even if forbidden. The idea of rebellion, of secrets, of possibility, became a private fire in his heart, a flame that would persist even in the darkest hours. By the end of the week, Nakht carried not only the physical scars of labor, but also the subtle awareness of a mind awakening. He understood that endurance alone was not enough, that knowledge, observation, and imagination were equally essential. The rumors, whispered quietly among the huts and along the Nile, had introduced a new rhythm to his life, one of subtle vigilance, of private planning, of hope held in silence. Even in the harsh rhythm of labor, life occasionally offered fleeting moments of reprieve. Nakht first noticed them during the festivals, celebrations that punctuated the otherwise relentless cycle of work and survival. These events were rare, dictated by the lunar calendar, the flooding of the Nile, or the pharaoh's desire to honor the gods. For a brief span, the world seemed to shift, if only slightly, and slaves could glimpse a side of life that existed beyond sweat, dust, and stone. The preparations began days in advance. Nakht was assigned tasks that differed from the usual labor: cleaning courtyards, carrying decorations, arranging flowers, or setting small altars. There was an energy in the air that was difficult to ignore. The Nile reflected more vividly under the sun, dust seemed to shimmer, and the songs of priests echoed farther than usual. Even the overseers appeared distracted, temporarily absorbed in ceremonial duties, their usual vigilance softened by the necessity of perfection in festival preparations. On the day itself, Nakht was allowed moments to observe. Priests chanted in long, melodic sequences, raising their voices to honor Ra, Hathor, and Osiris. The temple courtyards were filled with offerings of bread, wine, and small figurines, arranged meticulously on polished stones. Musicians played wooden flutes, harps, and percussion instruments, their melodies creating a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the heartbeat of the Nile itself. Dancers moved gracefully, their bodies adorned with bright linen and colored beads, swaying in patterns that spoke of divine order and beauty. Nakht could feel the music in his chest, a vibration that reminded him of the body's potential for wonder even amid hardship. Food during these festivals was also extraordinary. Bread was richer, mixed with honey or sesame seeds. Meat, a rarity, was cooked over open fires and flavored with herbs that Nakht had never tasted before. Beer was stronger and more generous, poured into clay cups and passed around cautiously. For a brief moment, the physical burden of hunger lifted. Nakht shared what he could with his companions, feeling the warmth of camaraderie as they laughed quietly, their voices low so as not to attract attention. Even the smallest morsels tasted like abundance, a reminder that life could sometimes bend toward comfort, however temporarily. Despite the beauty and abundance, Nakht remained vigilant. The festivals were layered with social hierarchies that reminded him of his place. He observed the pharaoh, or more often the royal stand-ins, receiving offerings and acknowledging the priests with gestures of grandeur. Guards and officials moved swiftly, ensuring no chaos erupted, and the overseers kept subtle watch over the slaves, ensuring that the brief indulgence did not spill into disobedience. Even in celebration, power maintained its presence, subtle yet unyielding. Nakht also noticed the communal aspects of these events among the slaves themselves. Between tasks, they whispered small stories, jokes, and songs, creating a hidden layer of festivity that belonged only to them. He found himself drawn into quiet games, sharing fleeting moments of play with children or exchanging cautious laughter with older companions. These instances, though small, were monumental in Nakht's mind, proof that the human spirit could assert itself even in the shadow of servitude, finding light where it was least expected. Religious observances intertwined with entertainment. Nakht watched as priests performed ritual dances to symbolize the sun's journey across the sky, the cycles of life and death, and the balance of order and chaos. Each movement, each chant, was designed to convey the grandeur of the gods and the pharaoh's role as their earthly representative. Nakht was struck by the precision and artistry, but he also understood the implicit message. Humans, especially those of low rank, existed to serve, observe, and endure. The festivals celebrated divinity and hierarchy simultaneously, beauty coexisting with a subtle reinforcement of control. Yet, Nakht found personal meaning even within this framework. Watching the dancers and musicians, he began imagining movement that was free, not dictated by overseers or ritual requirements. Listening to the music, he visualized rhythms beyond control, imagining songs of his own, melodies for which no punishment awaited. These fantasies were private, invisible, but they nourished a sense of autonomy he could claim even in a world structured entirely by others. As the day progressed, the heat of the sun softened, and the festivities moved toward evening. Fires were lit, casting flickering light on polished stones and golden ornaments. Shadows danced among the columns, merging with the voices of priests and the laughter of the privileged. Nakht's muscles, exhausted from both work and moments of exertion during the festival, trembled with fatigue, but he felt a rare sense of connection to the wider world. The festival reminded him that the Nile's cycles, the pharaoh's orders, and the god's influence were all part of a rhythm that extended beyond his immediate suffering. It was a small window into a larger universe, one in which beauty, order, and celebration could exist alongside labor, pain, and inequality. Night fell slowly, stars emerging above the desert and river. Nakht returned to the huts, carrying not only the fatigue of the day but also the memory of sights and sounds that had lifted him briefly above survival. The aroma of festival fires lingered faintly in his clothes and hair. He listened to companions recount their impressions, their whispers carrying both wonder and longing. Even in the quiet of the huts, the festival's effects endured. Renewed camaraderie, a subtle hope, and a reminder that life occasionally offered moments of abundance and delight, however fleeting. Though the festival was temporary, its lessons were lasting. Nakht realized that even in the strictest hierarchies, in the harshest labor, there were opportunities to witness beauty, to claim private joy, and to strengthen bonds among those who shared the same burdens. The day had shown him that life was more than endurance. It was observation, reflection, and imagination. Even slaves could experience moments that reminded them of the world's richness, even if only for hours, and even if only through the lens of another's celebration. By the time Nakht lay on the hard floor that night, his body exhausted yet invigorated by the rare indulgence, he felt something that had been missing for years, a glimpse of possibility. The festivals reminded him that the world could shift, if only momentarily, and that hope, though fragile, was a force that could survive even the harshest chains. In those fleeting hours, Nakht discovered that life's rhythm was not entirely dictated by overseers, labor, or pain. Sometimes it moved to a different, more beautiful beat, and for that brief moment, he danced quietly within his imagination, free in ways no one could ever touch. The Nile was both lifeline and enigma, a force that shaped the lives of all who dwelled along its banks. For Nakht, it was more than a source of water or a route for transport. It was a quiet teacher, a place where subtle freedoms could be discovered and secrets glimpsed in the rippling currents and shaded banks. After countless days of hauling stones, carrying heavy bundles of reeds, and enduring overseers' scrutiny, Nakht began to notice the river's hidden rhythms, the small spaces where one could breathe without fear, and the ways it offered a faint, temporary reprieve from the rigidity of his world. The first secret Nakht discovered was a narrow bend in the river, shielded by tall papyrus reeds. From the path, it appeared nothing more than a thin channel, easily overlooked. Yet from inside the dense growth, Nakht could see the flow of the Nile uninterrupted, the water glimmering in the sun, birds alighting on floating leaves, and fish darting through shallow currents. Here, the overseer's presence was minimal. Their patrols rarely noticed this hidden corner. Nakht learned to move silently, to step on soft mud and avoid snapping reeds, and for the first time in years, he felt a small taste of autonomy. Water itself became a ritual, almost sacred in these secret spaces. Nakht would kneel at the bank, cupping water in his hands, feeling its coolness against his sun-scorched skin. He drank slowly, savoring each swallow as though it carried not only life but freedom. Sometimes he let the water flow over his hands, imagining it washing away the dust, the sweat, and the pain of endless labor. These moments, private and hidden, reminded Nakht that even in bondage, the world held small gifts, opportunities to reclaim control over his body, if not over the life imposed upon him. The river also taught observation and patience. Nakht noticed patterns in the movement of boats, in the rotation of fishermen, and even in the subtle behavior of birds. He saw which spots along the bank were rarely observed, which reeds concealed small paths, and where currents created temporary eddies that could hide movement. Every discovery was a lesson in subtlety, a proof that vigilance and attention could create pockets of freedom even under constant surveillance. Nakht began mapping these hidden routes in his mind, noting where he could move quietly, where he could rest unseen, and how to exploit the rhythm of the river for safety and solace. Sometimes Nakht ventured farther, drawn by curiosity and the promise of undiscovered places. He found shallow pools tucked behind low embankments where water lilies floated, untouched by humans. In these places, he could sit, legs submerged, listening to the gentle lapping of water and the whisper of reeds in the breeze. The sounds were soft, hypnotic, almost meditative, contrasting sharply with the clatter of tools, the shouts of overseers, and the relentless sun that dominated his labor elsewhere. It was in these secret spots that Nakht learned to breathe more deeply, to let his mind wander, and to cultivate resilience in ways that bricks and stones could never teach. The river was also a conduit for communication and rumor. Nakht noticed that fishermen, though often wary of slaves, occasionally passed notes or messages along the banks, subtle exchanges that could carry information about the wider world. Some spoke of distant towns, changes in temple practices, or even new pharaoh's decrees. Others whispered warnings, small instructions, or guidance about where to avoid patrols. Nakht learned to interpret gestures, the position of oars, and subtle signals in the current. Each encounter, each observation, became a lesson in understanding the layers of power, secrecy, and human ingenuity that existed even outside the strict bounds of the palace or the overseer's field. One day, Nakht discovered a nearly hidden alcove behind a bend in the reeds. It was shallow, partially submerged, but large enough for a man to crouch without being seen. Here, he could spend hours alone, observing the world with minimal risk. He watched the sun glint on the water, studied the reflections of clouds and palm trees, and occasionally glimpsed the silhouettes of distant villages across the river. In these hours, Nakht's imagination flourished. He imagined sailing down the Nile, exploring lands unknown, and perhaps someday finding freedom not just in thought, but in movement. These moments became a private sanctuary, a mental and spiritual respite from a life dominated by labor, hierarchy, and constant surveillance. The river also offered lessons in impermanence and adaptation. Currents shifted, waters rose and fell with the seasons, and banks that were safe one day could be flooded or eroded the next. Nakht learned to read the signs. The smell of the mud, the flow of small tributaries, the behavior of birds and insects. Every subtle clue became part of his mental map, a way to anticipate danger, find food, or discover temporary refuge. In understanding the river, Nakht discovered that knowledge could be as vital as strength, foresight as crucial as endurance. Even in these hidden moments, Nakht remained acutely aware of risk. Patrols could pass at any time, and a single misstep could draw attention, punishments, or worse. Yet the river's secrets were precious precisely because they offered a controlled gamble, a space where curiosity could coexist with caution. Nakht learned the delicate balance of visibility and concealment, of patience and action, and how the smallest insights could become tools of survival. By the time night fell, Nakht returned to the huts, coated in mud, sweat, and dust, yet carrying something invisible but invaluable. The Nile had become a teacher, a companion, and a subtle liberator. Through observation, patience, and careful movement, he had discovered small spaces where life felt less dictated by the overseers, less dominated by the relentless demands of Pharaoh's world. The river reminded him that even in chains, freedom could be glimpsed, nurtured, and practiced in quiet, private ways that no whip or command could entirely erase. Everywhere Nakht went, the overseer's shadow followed, sometimes literally, stretching across the scorching sunlit courtyards, and sometimes metaphorically, in the unyielding gaze, the sharp tone, the silent threat behind each word. The overseer was both presence and force, a constant reminder of the fragile boundary between life and pain. Nakht had long understood that survival depended not only on strength and skill, but on reading the moods, habits, and whims of the overseers. Each day, each hour, demanded vigilance. Any lapse could result in punishment, humiliation, or worse. Nakht had learned to observe subtle cues. The way an overseer's eyebrows lifted, the twitch of a jaw, or a foot tapping against stone. All were signals that work was being judged, that a reprimand might be imminent. He could feel tension radiating from them before it manifested, adjusting his posture, his pace, even his breathing to avoid provoking attention. In this dance, Nakht found a form of control. Anticipation became a weapon, and observation, a shield. Even in chains, awareness could carve a small space of safety. Punishments were swift and public, designed to reinforce obedience and maintain order. Nakht had witnessed men struck across the back with thick sticks, kneeling in dust while overseers barked commands. The sound of the lash, the cracking of wood against skin, was a language he had learned to interpret. It spoke of limits, boundaries, and the cost of misstep. Nakht himself had been struck before, learning the precise moment when labor crossed into the danger zone. The memory of pain shaped his decisions, his movements, and his strategy for survival. Fear, he realized, was a tool, but so was calculation. Yet the overseer's presence was not only a force of domination, it was also a source of challenge and subtle defiance. Nakht began noticing cracks in their authority, moments when control was imperfect, when rules were bent, and when human weakness emerged. A momentary lapse of attention allowed a stone to be smoothed more carefully. A pause in supervision permitted whispered conversation, and a shared glance among slaves conveyed understanding without words. Nakht learned to navigate these gaps, using patience and subtlety as instruments of survival and, sometimes, quiet resistance. The overseer's routines themselves became a puzzle to decode. Nakht observed when they grew irritable, when fatigue dulled their vigilance, or when personal indulgences distracted them from their role. He memorized patrol paths, noting where the riverbank could be accessed without notice, which hut corners remained unobserved, and when voices could be lowered for communication. Knowledge became strategy. The overseer's shadow was heavy, but understanding its movement allowed Nakht to reclaim fragments of autonomy, even within a system designed to suppress it entirely. At times, Nakht witnessed small displays of cruelty that were more psychological than physical. The overseer might single out a man for humiliation, forcing him to perform a task repeatedly while others watched, or mock a worker for minor errors. These acts were designed to reinforce hierarchy and obedience, but they also revealed the overseer's human vulnerabilities: vanity, insecurity, and the desire for recognition. Nakht learned to read not just the threat but the man behind it, gaining insight into how power was exercised and, occasionally, how it might be subtly undermined. Nakht also discovered the power of silent alliances. Small gestures, sharing water, adjusting a load of reeds, signaling with a glance, became methods of mutual support among slaves. These acts were invisible to the overseers, yet they built trust and resilience within the group. Nakht realized that survival was not solely an individual endeavor. It was woven through collective awareness, subtle cooperation, and shared knowledge of the overseer's tendencies. Even under the shadow of authority, community offered protection, advice, and occasionally solace. Yet tension persisted. Every action carried risk, and Nakht understood that misjudging the overseer could bring immediate consequences. One day, he miscalculated the timing of a water break, glancing at the river for a fleeting moment longer than permitted. The overseer noticed, voice rising sharply, eyes narrowing with fury. Nakht froze, muscles tense, heart pounding. But he had learned to respond with deference, careful speech, and measured apology. The threat passed, leaving only the reminder that vigilance was a constant requirement, and that small errors were never without cost. Despite the danger, Nakht also began to sense a peculiar rhythm in the overseer's presence. There were moments when authority was strict and unyielding, and others when distraction, fatigue, or routine softened the pressure. In these moments, Nakht experimented with small tests of autonomy, adjusting a stone more carefully, shifting a burden to ease a companion's load, pausing briefly to breathe. Each act was tiny, almost imperceptible, yet each reinforced his understanding that even within rigid systems, opportunity for agency existed. Over time, Nakht's awareness transformed into strategy. He could anticipate when labor would peak, when punishment was likely, and when subtle subversions could occur without notice. He began to treat the overseer's shadow not only as a source of threat but as a puzzle, a rhythm to interpret, and a system within which he could maneuver. Awareness became survival. Observation became a form of resistance. Patience became power. Even in a world built on domination, Nakht discovered that careful attention could carve spaces for autonomy, subtle safety, and quiet hope. By the end of the day, Nakht returned to the huts with muscles aching, back blistered, and skin scorched, yet carrying an intangible reward: knowledge. The overseer's shadow, though omnipresent, no longer represented only fear. It had become a guide, a pattern to read, and a challenge to navigate. Nakht understood that survival depended not solely on physical endurance, but on mental acuity, social awareness, and the courage to act wisely within constraints. In this understanding, he found a measure of control, a flicker of agency, and a quiet assertion of self that no whip, gaze, or command could entirely erase. The harsh routines of slavery had taught Nakht more than endurance. They had nurtured skills that went unnoticed by overseers but were invaluable to survival. Strength, yes, but also observation, patience, and subtle craft. He began to recognize that these hidden abilities were as essential as muscle, offering opportunities to improve not only his own chances of survival but also the lives of those around him. Nakht noticed patterns in the work that others failed to see. The shape and weight of stones, the texture of mud bricks, even the flow of water for mixing mortar, each element could be used more efficiently if observed carefully. He learned to adjust his posture, the angle of lifting, and the timing of movements to reduce exhaustion. This was not rebellion. It was adaptation. Yet every adjustment, every refinement, gave him a measure of control in a world that otherwise stripped autonomy away. He also began developing skills that were subtle, almost invisible. For instance, Nakht discovered ways to repair small tools using bits of scrap wood or softened leather, improvising with materials scavenged from construction sites. He could tie knots and ropes to reinforce loads, smooth baskets to increase durability, and even fashion makeshift grips to ease the strain on hands blistered from repetitive labor. These skills were unremarkable in the eyes of overseers, yet they allowed Nakht to work more efficiently, endure more comfortably, and retain his strength for longer hours. Nakht's observations extended beyond tools and labor. He studied the habits of other slaves, learning who could be trusted, who had knowledge of secret paths, and who was prone to betrayal. Subtle alliances formed through quiet gestures, shared food, and discreet warnings. Nakht learned to communicate in ways that left no trace, using eye contact, a slight nod, or the placement of objects to convey messages. Each interaction built a network of awareness that made the group more resilient against punishment, theft, or harsh oversight. He also observed the natural world, learning to anticipate changes in weather, water levels, and the behavior of animals. Small birds, the flight of insects, and the sound of distant frogs became signals, indicators of seasonal shifts or environmental dangers. Nakht realized that understanding nature was as critical as understanding men, that survival required not only strength but attunement to every rhythm of the world around him. These lessons, gleaned quietly, became tools he could use to plan labor, protect himself, and even assist others in subtle, life-saving ways. Nakht's intelligence extended to reading the overseers themselves. He noted the brief flickers of attention, the patterns of scrutiny, and even moments of fatigue or distraction. By observing these subtle shifts, Nakht learned when he could pause to rest, when a task could be performed more carefully, and when a whispered warning could save a companion from punishment. Awareness of human behavior became as important as physical skill. Every glance, every gesture, every tone of voice carried potential insight. One of Nakht's most valuable hidden skills emerged from this combination of observation and quiet action: foresight. He began to anticipate challenges before they arose. A sudden change in workload, the approach of a particularly cruel overseer, or the arrival of new supplies could all be prepared for. Nakht would adjust his movements, his load, and his vigilance, positioning himself to avoid injury or exhaustion. This foresight became a silent form of power, a private advantage in a life dominated by others. Nakht also experimented with subtle acts of resistance, not overt rebellion but careful defiance. A load might be adjusted to ease a companion's burden, a stone smoothed with extra care to prevent a breakdown, or a small act of ingenuity applied to make labor more tolerable. These actions were invisible to overseers but significant in the lives of those who shared them. Nakht discovered that even the smallest gestures could improve life quietly, asserting agency where overt action was impossible. Over time, Nakht began to see these hidden skills as a form of empowerment. While he could not escape the overseer's gaze, he could manipulate his environment and his body to create pockets of control. While he could not alter the hierarchies of the palace, he could navigate them with intelligence and subtlety. While he could not change his status, he could shape moments within it, improving efficiency, safety, and resilience. In these quiet acts, Nakht discovered a private form of freedom. Even more importantly, Nakht began to share these skills carefully with trusted companions. A whispered instruction on how to carry a load with less strain, a secret method for reinforcing baskets, or guidance on reading the overseer's mood became gifts of knowledge. Trust built through these shared skills strengthened the bonds among slaves, creating a subtle, resilient network of human cooperation. Knowledge, Nakht realized, could be as potent as strength, and shared wisdom could protect, uplift, and unite in ways that force never could. By the end of the day, Nakht returned to the huts, muscles sore but mind sharp, carrying a sense of quiet accomplishment. The overseer's shadow remained, the labor persisted, and the chains of servitude remained unbroken. Yet Nakht understood that survival was layered, multidimensional, and that the cultivation of hidden skills could provide resilience, subtle power, and moments of control. He had learned that even within oppression, intelligence, observation, and craft could forge an invisible but vital strength, one that no overseer could fully measure or take away. As Nakht lay beneath the stars that night, listening to the distant flow of the Nile, he realized that strength was not merely physical, endurance not merely pain. Survival demanded subtlety, cunning, and quiet skill. He had discovered the value of hidden abilities of observation and foresight, and he understood that these gifts, nurtured carefully, might one day offer more than survival. They might offer the first whispers of freedom. The desert began where the fertile banks of the Nile slowly gave way to dust, stone, and heat shimmering in waves above the sand. Nakht had long observed it from a distance, the endless expanse seeming both hostile and strangely alluring. Few slaves ever ventured beyond the river's immediate edge. The overseers feared the desert as much as they feared rebellion. Yet Nakht's curiosity, honed by years of careful observation and quiet ingenuity, could not resist the challenge. He began to explore its margins in secret, moving when the sun was low, shadows long, and overseers' patrols distracted by labor or ritual. The first discovery was subtle. The desert was not a blank, lifeless expanse, but a landscape alive with hidden patterns and muted signs. Tracks of small animals marked the sand like secret codes, indicating water, shelter, or safe passage. Distant hills created wind corridors, funneling cool breezes through valleys that were otherwise hidden from view. Nakht learned to read these signs carefully, noticing how the color of the sand shifted with depth, how the shadows lengthened and shrank, and how temperature changes could reveal the location of shade or moisture. The desert, harsh as it was, held secrets for those patient enough to observe. He began to discover pockets of life, thorny shrubs bearing edible fruits, shallow depressions collecting rainwater long after the Nile had receded, and insects whose movement hinted at nearby prey or resources. Nakht realized that knowledge of the environment was as powerful as knowledge of overseers. The desert demanded adaptation, attention, and caution. Every step carried both risk and reward. A momentary lapse could result in dehydration, injury, or disorientation. Yet in learning these rhythms, Nakht felt a new sense of agency, a feeling of being part of a world broader than the riverbanks, overseers, and brick-laden fields. Traveling along the desert's edge also offered Nakht encounters that were rare, fleeting, and educational. He observed travelers moving with camels or donkeys, merchants carrying exotic goods, and priests visiting minor shrines. These glimpses into a wider world fascinated him. Foreign objects, unfamiliar clothing, and snippets of conversations that hinted at lands and customs far beyond his immediate reality. Nakht learned to interpret gestures, the cadence of speech, and even the way animals moved, absorbing information without drawing attention. These experiences expanded his understanding of human behavior and social dynamics, providing lessons that could never be taught in the brutal labor of the Nile. The desert, however, was not without danger. Shifting sand could conceal treacherous dips, and sudden gusts of wind could strip the air of moisture and visibility. Nakht learned to move methodically, leaving markers or mental notes, observing patterns of the sun and the stars to maintain orientation. He discovered that survival depended on combining physical caution with mental mapping, observation, and a willingness to retreat when conditions proved unsafe. These excursions required courage, patience, and a disciplined awareness that Nakht had honed over years under the overseer's shadow. Among these lessons, Nakht also encountered the echoes of legend and myth. Desert travelers whispered of spirits inhabiting remote dunes, of sacred stones that marked the edge of sacred lands, and of mysterious ruins buried beneath sand. Nakht found himself drawn to these stories, not out of superstition, but out of curiosity. He realized that myths contained subtle truths, warnings about danger, knowledge of hidden resources, and insights into human belief systems. By interpreting these tales carefully, Nakht added another layer to his understanding of the environment, blending observation with imagination in ways that strengthened both his survival skills and his mental resilience. Nakht's explorations also revealed the quiet persistence of nature. He observed hawks circling high above, foxes darting between scrub, and desert blooms that appeared after rare rains. These small phenomena taught him patience, humility, and respect. The desert did not yield to force. It responded to attentiveness and adaptability. Nakht internalized these lessons, recognizing that endurance alone was insufficient. Intelligence, observation, and timing were equally vital. The desert became both teacher and test, revealing his limitations and expanding his awareness simultaneously. Occasionally, Nakht encountered other slaves who had dared to stray from the riverbank, seeking food, water, or knowledge. These meetings were brief, cautious, and charged with tension. Mutual recognition in a shared glance, a nod, or the silent exchange of supplies created unspoken alliances. Nakht realized that even among the oppressed, networks could exist, offering guidance, resources, or companionship. These encounters reinforced his understanding that survival was not only individual but relational, dependent on trust, subtlety, and discretion. Through these excursions, Nakht began to develop a private map of the desert's edges, learning where the terrain offered cover, which dunes were unstable, and which paths connected back to hidden river alcoves. This knowledge became a silent advantage, a source of empowerment in a world otherwise dominated by overseers and pharaohs. Nakht understood that mastery of the environment, combined with intelligence and observation, could create possibilities previously unimaginable. A private sphere of control in an existence otherwise defined by constraint. By nightfall, Nakht returned to the Nile, carrying not only physical fatigue but also a sense of expansion. The river's banks remained familiar, the overseer's eyes vigilant, and labor unrelenting, yet Nakht had glimpsed horizons beyond the known. The desert had offered lessons in observation, patience, adaptation, and courage. Each secret path, each hidden resource, and each fleeting encounter became a thread in the tapestry of his growing understanding. Nakht recognized that knowledge itself was a kind of freedom, subtle, invisible, yet profound in its potential. News of the pharaohs will reach Nakht and the other workers not through direct proclamation, but through the subtle tremors it sent across the labor sites. Overseers moved with unusual urgency, their voices sharper, their gestures more demanding, and their eyes scanning for the slightest lapse in obedience. Nakht had learned over the years to sense the ripple effects of distant power, to understand that the commands of the pharaoh, though physically absent, were enforced with meticulous care through chains of human control. The Nile's banks seemed to quiver with anticipation, the air thick with dust and tension, as if the river itself sensed the weight of royal decree. The new orders were far-reaching. Projects that had been routine for years suddenly shifted in scope. Stone blocks had to be transported to more distant quarries, canals required faster excavation, and temple walls demanded more intricate carvings. The pharaoh had commissioned monuments not merely for beauty, but for the enduring assertion of power, a visible reminder of divine authority over every brick, every grain of sand, and every human laborer. Nakht could see the purpose in the work. Each stone was a testament, each line etched into granite a reminder that the pharaoh's reach extended beyond life itself. Nakht noticed the overseer's behavior change immediately. They no longer relied solely on routine intimidation. They intensified scrutiny, testing endurance and obedience with subtle variations. A command might be repeated twice, then ignored entirely, leaving the worker uncertain of expectation. Tasks were assigned with deceptive complexity, and punishments were increasingly unpredictable. Nakht recognized that these shifts were designed not only to increase labor efficiency, but to break complacency, ensuring that no slave could rely solely on habit. Survival now required heightened attention, not just strength. In the midst of this upheaval, Nakht discovered the strategic advantage of adaptability. He anticipated sudden changes, adjusted his movements to the overseer's moods, and subtly helped companions navigate unfamiliar tasks. His knowledge of the Nile, hidden desert paths, and minor skills in tool repair allowed him to maintain productivity while avoiding unnecessary punishment. Nakht realized that intelligence and observation were as vital as physical endurance. In a world where decrees could arrive without warning, flexibility was survival. The Pharaoh's orders also introduced competition among slaves. New quotas were established, and subtle comparisons were drawn between work quality and speed. Nakht observed how tension spread, creating rivalries that served the overseer's purposes. Yet he also saw opportunities to foster cooperation. By quietly advising companions on load distribution or tool maintenance, Nakht ensured that small teams could operate efficiently and minimize injuries. Knowledge became a form of currency, exchanged quietly, reinforcing solidarity even under heightened pressure. Amid these demands, Nakht began to observe the political dimension of labor. He noticed that some overseers sought favor with higher authorities, exaggerating accomplishments or hiding failures to secure personal advantage. Temples became more than sacred spaces. They were instruments of power, signaling loyalty, wealth, and divine sanction. Nakht realized that survival was not merely about completing tasks, but about understanding the web of authority that stretched from pharaoh to overseer, from overseer to laborer. Each stone, each canal, each measurement of brick was embedded within a larger system of control and symbolism. The pharaoh's orders also indirectly illuminated the lives of the elite. Nakht could glimpse the flow of goods, the arrival of exotic materials, and the rituals designed to impress visiting dignitaries. Each event reinforced the hierarchy, making the contrast with his own constrained life stark. Yet Nakht's curiosity transformed observation into strategy. By noting the timing of deliveries, the paths of officials, and the movements of elite servants, he gained insights that might be applied subtly to survival, to small advantages, or even to future opportunity. Knowledge, again, became a form of empowerment. Work under these new directives became grueling. Stones were heavier, canals deeper, and measurements exacting. Mistakes were punished more harshly, yet Nakht noticed the overseers themselves were strained, fatigued, and occasionally careless. He used these small openings to anticipate errors, adjust procedures, and protect companions from harm. Each act required careful judgment. One misstep could bring reprimand, but subtle timing could yield relative safety. Nakht had learned to navigate the tension between obedience and initiative, understanding that intelligence and foresight could offset sheer physical strain. Beyond labor, Nakht also began contemplating the symbolic significance of the pharaoh's decrees. Each monument, canal, or temple was designed to endure, to project authority, and to bind generations to a vision of order and divinity. Nakht reflected on the human cost hidden behind the grandeur. The long hours, blisters, and fatigue, the silent suffering beneath polished stone. The awareness was painful, yet it strengthened his resolve. Survival was not merely physical. It was moral, mental, and strategic, requiring comprehension of the forces shaping his life. At night, after the overseers had returned to their quarters and the Nile reflected the moonlight in silver streaks, Nakht lay on the dusty banks, pondering the pharaoh's influence. He understood that power was enacted through layers, through both decree and interpretation, through authority and subtle human behavior. Survival demanded mastery of these layers, of observation, adaptation, discretion, and quiet alliance. He had witnessed the pharaoh's reach without seeing him, felt the weight of command without direct confrontation, and discovered the subtle mechanics that kept the empire running. The day's labor ended, but Nakht's understanding expanded. He realized that knowledge of systems, hidden patterns, and human behavior was as crucial as endurance. Each stone carried weight not only in its mass but in its symbolism. Each canal was a channel for both water and influence, and each order from the pharaoh shaped both physical reality and the psychology of slaves. Nakht understood that survival required comprehension of forces far beyond immediate control, and that observation, intelligence, and subtle skill were as vital as strength or endurance. As he drifted into uneasy sleep beneath the stars, Nakht carried the awareness that life under the pharaoh was both rigid and fluid, a structure of absolute authority that nevertheless contained gaps, weaknesses, and opportunities. Knowledge, cunning, and quiet skill might one day provide not only survival but the ability to navigate, and perhaps influence, the very system that sought to confine him. The shadow of the pharaoh stretched across his world, vast and intimidating, yet Nakht sensed that within that shadow existed patterns to understand, exploit, and endure. The quarries were a world apart, a vast expanse of stone and dust where labor and skill intertwined under the scorching sun. Nakht had long seen them from a distance, but only now, as the pharaoh's orders intensified, did he find himself sent to work among the largest blocks of limestone and granite. The air was thick with fine particles that clung to skin and lungs, and the heat radiated off the jagged surfaces. Yet Nakht felt a thrill of purpose. Here, the work demanded more than brute force. It required observation, technique, and quiet mastery. Nakht quickly realized that the quarry was a place where knowledge and subtle craft could yield both survival and status among peers. He watched skilled stoneworkers, noting the angles of chisels, the placement of wedges, and the rhythm of strikes that caused fractures to propagate along natural lines rather than forcing the stone to yield. There was an elegance to the labor, a harmony between human strength and the hidden structure of the rock. Nakht absorbed these lessons carefully, understanding that mastery here could spare effort, reduce injury, and gain favor with overseers impressed by efficiency. The quarry also revealed a hidden social order. Among the slaves, some were valued for knowledge of stone, how to split blocks without cracking them, how to select fragments for carving, and how to transport them efficiently. These workers enjoyed subtle advantages: lighter loads, less scrutiny, and occasional privileges. Nakht sought their attention, observing discreetly, asking careful questions when opportunity allowed, and learning to apply their techniques without drawing notice. Slowly, he began to refine his own methods, moving with both precision and speed. Observation extended beyond technique to the environment itself. Nakht noticed how natural fissures in the rock could guide his strikes, how sunlight revealed weak points in the stone, and how the slightest vibrations traveled through blocks, signaling potential breakage. He learned to listen to the stone, to anticipate its response, and to adjust force accordingly. This deep attention transformed labor into a form of dialogue, a negotiation between human and material where patience and insight could reduce toil and preserve strength. The quarry was also a place where danger was tangible and ever-present. Heavy blocks could shift unexpectedly, tools could snap, and cliffs could crumble if one miscalculated. Nakht discovered that understanding these hazards was as critical as knowing the overseer's temperament. Safety depended on reading the stone, predicting its behavior, and moving with precision. Each day demanded both physical endurance and mental calculation, reinforcing the lesson that survival was as much a matter of perception and foresight as it was of muscle. Among the workers, Nakht found a subtle network of mentorship. Experienced stonecutters offered advice through discreet gestures, the angle of a wedge, the rhythm of a strike, or the proper stance for lifting. Nakht absorbed these teachings silently, knowing that knowledge in this environment could be more valuable than speed or raw strength. He began to anticipate fractures before they occurred, align chisels for maximum efficiency, and assist companions in ways that reduced risk for all. Skill became both shield and currency, earning respect and safety in equal measure. Nakht also began to notice the psychology of oversight in this environment. Overseers were more lenient with those who demonstrated skill and knowledge, focusing attention on slower, less competent workers. Nakht realized that mastery could manipulate perception. Efficiency signaled obedience, competence signaled utility, and both could temper the severity of punishment. The quarry became a stage where intelligence, patience, and subtlety could shape not only outcomes but the attitudes of those who wielded power over him. Beyond practical skill, the quarry revealed stories etched into the stone itself. Marks from previous projects, faint inscriptions, and remnants of unfinished blocks spoke of past workers, forgotten orders, and the passage of time. Nakht found fascination in these silent narratives, the echoes of human effort, struggle, and ingenuity embedded in rock. Each mark became a lesson, a connection across generations, and a reminder that labor, though exhausting, could leave enduring traces of presence, knowledge, and artistry. The physicality of quarry work was unrelenting, yet Nakht discovered that mental focus could transform fatigue into rhythm. By observing patterns in the stone, coordinating with companions, and anticipating natural weaknesses, he reduced effort and preserved strength. Each strike, each lift, each adjustment became part of a larger understanding of efficiency and survival. Nakht realized that the mind could guide the body with precision, making even brutal labor a realm of strategy and subtle mastery. As days passed, Nakht's confidence grew. He could navigate the quarry with attentiveness, assisting others while preserving himself. His awareness of both stone and human behavior provided advantages invisible to overseers yet vital to survival. The quarry had become more than a place of punishment. It was a training ground for observation, skill, patience, and subtle influence. Nakht understood that each block he worked, each technique he mastered, and each alliance he nurtured reinforced his capacity to endure, adapt, and perhaps one day transcend the constraints imposed by the Pharaoh. By the end of each day, Nakht returned to the riverbank exhausted yet enlightened. The stones bore silent witness to his growing understanding, the overseers remained vigilant, and the Nile shimmered quietly as if acknowledging his small victories. Nakht had discovered that labor could teach as much as it punished, that skill and observation could carve autonomy even in chains, and that survival was both physical and intellectual, a delicate interplay of knowledge, patience, and quiet mastery.